There is a building in almost every capital city in the world that looks from the outside like it belongs there. It sits behind iron gates or low stone walls. It flies a flag. It has a reception desk and a waiting room with chairs bolted to the floor, and a clerk who stamps your paperwork without looking you in the eye. During the day, it hums with the ordinary business of visas and passports and trade agreements and consular notifications. Typewriters clatter, phones ring and are answered in clipped professional voices. People come and go with briefcases and badges, and the politely distracted expressions of people who work in offices where the work is never quite finished. And then the afternoon light begins to soften. The public counters close. The visa applicants drift away. The typists gather their things and head out into the foreign street with its unfamiliar smells and sounds. The building exhales, or seems to. The flag above the gate catches a cooler evening wind. And somewhere on an upper floor, behind a door that does not appear on the official floor plan, behind a cipher lock and a heavy steel frame that looks ordinary only if you do not look too carefully, another kind of work begins. This is an embassy, and inside it, if you know where the rooms are and what the numbers mean, there is a station.
Not a train station, not a radio station, a CIA station, a small sealed room, or a suite of rooms, or sometimes nothing more than a converted supply closet with a secure cable terminal and a safe, and a man at a desk who is officially listed in the diplomatic registry as a cultural attaché, or a second secretary, or an agricultural liaison officer. His name is real. His cover is not. His salary comes from one place and his orders come from another. And the distance between those two facts is measured not in miles, but in the particular silence of a man who has learned to live inside a careful lie. These stations were among the most consequential small rooms of the 20th century. Quiet rooms, in quiet buildings, in cities where enormous things were being decided. Paris in the late 1940s, where communism felt like a tide coming in. Tehran in the early 1950s, where oil and empire were negotiating their final terms. Berlin, always and forever, a city sliced in half by ideology and concrete, and the quiet terror of a divided world. Tokyo, just beginning to breathe again after the devastation of war. Beirut, Rome, Vienna, Mexico City. Cities where the Cold War was not a metaphor, but a daily texture, a thing you felt when you crossed a street, or stepped into the wrong cafe, or looked up to find someone looking back at you with slightly too much patience.
In all of these cities, in all of these buildings, behind all of these ordinary-looking doors, people were doing things that did not appear in any official record. They were meeting agents in parks and in the back rooms of restaurants. They were passing small packages under tables and leaving chalk marks on walls, and sending cables in code to a headquarters that was, in those early years, still figuring out what it was supposed to be. They were conducting, at enormous personal risk and with no guarantee of success, the business of intelligence. The slow, patient, methodical, and often deeply unglamorous work of finding things out. This is their story. Or at least, it is as much of their story as the records allow, as much as memory and declassification and the gradual loosening of official silence has permitted to surface. It is not a story of car chases or rooftop escapes, though there were those too sometimes.
it is mostly a story of routine, of paperwork and patience, of evenings at embassy receptions where you smiled and held your drink and listened very carefully to a man who did not know that you were listening, of mornings in a secure room waiting for a cable that might not come, of years spent in a foreign country, eating its food and learning its language and living its weather, while carrying inside you a second life that you shared with almost no one. Settle in. The night is quiet. The lights are low. And somewhere down the hall, behind a door you were never meant to notice, the station is open for business. Section 2. Before the agency existed, the OSS Shadow.
Before there was a CIA, there was something else, something rougher and more improvisational, and shaped not by bureaucratic design, but by the urgent, lurching demands of a world at war. It was called the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, and the men and women who built it, who staffed its makeshift stations in the bombed-out capitals and neutral backwaters of wartime Europe and Asia, were doing something that had never quite been done before in the American tradition. Organized, systematic, government-sanctioned espionage on a global scale. The United States had always been, officially at least, suspicious of permanent intelligence establishments. There was something that felt un-American about a standing spy service, something that smelled of the old world, of European courts and their poisoned whispers, of the kind of permanent institutional secrecy that republics were supposed to have outgrown. The Federal Bureau of Investigation handled domestic counterintelligence. The military had its own intelligence arms, but a centralized foreign intelligence service, operating in peacetime as well as war, with a budget and a structure and a mandate that went beyond any single theater of operations, that was new, and it made people nervous, and it would not have happened at all without the specific catastrophe of December 1941, and the specific ambitions of a specific man.
That man was William Joseph Donovan. He was a lawyer and a decorated soldier from the First World War, a Republican with bipartisan connections, a man of enormous physical courage and even more enormous personal energy. President Franklin Roosevelt sent him on informal intelligence tours of Europe before the war, and Donovan came back with the conviction that the United States was dangerously blind. It had no coordinated foreign intelligence capability. It had no capacity for covert operations. It was, in the intelligence sense, operating in the dark. Donovan proposed a remedy. Roosevelt agreed. And in June of 1942, by presidential order, the Office of Strategic Services was born. Within months, the OSS was establishing stations in every corner of the world where American interests, which meant Allied interests, were engaged. London, Cairo, Delhi, Chongqing, Algiers, and perhaps most consequentially, Bern, Switzerland. Bern was neutral. Switzerland was surrounded on all sides by Axis territory, which meant that it sat at the center of an enormous web of intelligence activity. Every intelligence service in the world that could get an officer into Switzerland was trying to do exactly that, because Switzerland was one of the few places on Earth where Germans and Britons and Americans could, in a certain carefully managed sense, breathe the same air, where information could cross lines, where agents could meet, where the quiet work of finding things out could happen at a remove from the shooting.
The man the OSS sent to Bern in November of 1942 was Alan Welsh Dulles. He was 49 years old, a former diplomat and Wall Street lawyer with an easy manner and a gift for cultivating trust in people who had reason to trust no one. He arrived in Bern under the cover of a special assistant at the American legation, and he set about building a network of informants and contacts that would become, by the end of the war, one of the most productive intelligence operations in American history. Dulles worked out of an apartment at Herrengasse 23. He made himself available in a carefully controlled way to people who had information to sell or share. He cultivated anti-Nazi Germans, dissidents, escaped prisoners, industrialists with doubts, military officers with consciences. He received information about German rocket programs, about the disposition of Wehrmacht forces, about internal political fractures inside the Nazi state. He ran agents into Germany itself. He maintained contact with resistance networks. He did all of this with a small staff and a limited budget, and the particular kind of patient attention that good intelligence work always requires. What Dulles built in Bern was not yet a CIA station. The CIA would not exist for another 5 years. But it was the template for what a CIA station would eventually be. A small, officially sanctioned presence in a foreign capital, operating under diplomatic cover, using the social and political landscape of the host country as both terrain and resource, building human networks, one carefully managed relationship at a time. The other OSS stations were doing similar work in different registers. In Cairo, officers were cultivating contacts across the Middle East. In India, they were working the fringes of the British Imperial Intelligence Network. In China, they were tangling with the complications of a country in the middle of a civil war that had been temporarily interrupted by a larger war. The quality of the work varied enormously, as did the quality of the officers. Some were brilliant, some were reckless, some were disasters. The OSS was, in the end, a wartime institution, built fast and run hard, and it showed. When Japan surrendered in August of 1945, President Harry Truman ordered the OSS dissolved. He was suspicious of it, suspicious of its ambitions, suspicious of Donovan, suspicious of the whole concept of a permanent intelligence establishment operating in peacetime with the kind of latitude the OSS had enjoyed in war. The OSS closed on October 1, 1945. Its files and some of its personnel were transferred to the State Department and the War Department. Its institutional memory scattered. But the people who had worked in it carried something with them. A knowledge of what was possible. A sense of what foreign intelligence looked like when it was done well. A set of habits and instincts and relationships that would, within 2 years, find a new institutional home. Section 3. The Birth of the CIA, 1947, and the Scramble to Build Stations. The world that emerged from the Second World War was not the world anyone had imagined. The post-war order that the Allied powers had sketched out in conferences and communiques and the optimistic language of the United Nations Charter was already beginning to fray before the ink was dry. The Soviet Union, which had been an ally of necessity, was consolidating its grip on Eastern Europe with a speed and thoroughness that alarmed everyone who was paying attention. Communist parties were making electoral gains in France and Italy. Civil war was consuming Greece. In China, Mao Zedong's forces were pushing the nationalist government toward its eventual collapse. In Iran, Soviet troops were slow to withdraw from the north, where they had been stationed under wartime agreements. The United States was powerful as it had never been powerful before, and it was frightened as it had rarely been frightened before. And out of that combination of power and fear, it was constructing, with considerable speed and some disorganization, the institutional architecture of a permanent national security state. The National Security Act of 1947 was the cornerstone of that architecture. It unified the military services under a new Department of Defense. It created the National Security Council to coordinate foreign policy and military planning, and it created the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA was given a broad mandate in carefully vague language. It was to coordinate the intelligence activities of the various government departments. It was to correlate and evaluate intelligence. It was to perform such other functions and duties related to intelligence affecting the national security as the National Security Council should direct. That last clause, the such other functions clause, would eventually become the legal basis for covert operations. But in the beginning, it was just language, and the new agency was less a finished institution than a construction site. The first director of Central Intelligence under the new law was Rear Admiral Roscoe Hellencoeter, a naval intelligence officer who found himself running an organization that barely existed yet. As the historian's record later revealed, the early CIA had almost nothing on the Soviet Union. One of Hellencoeter's successors, Richard Helms, would say in later years, only half joking, that the agency's analysts in those first years were better off doing their research at the Library of Congress than in CIA files, because the Library of Congress at least had books about Russia. The CIA had almost none. What the CIA did have, and what it began to deploy immediately, was a physical presence in foreign capitals, stations, small outposts in embassies around the world, staffed initially by a mixture of OSS veterans and new recruits, operating under diplomatic cover, tasked with doing what intelligence services do, collecting information, recruiting sources, and reporting back to headquarters. The scramble to establish these stations in the late 1940s was not orderly. There was competition with other agencies. The State Department did not always welcome the CIA's presence in its embassies. Military intelligence services had their own networks and their own turf to protect. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, under J. Edgar Hoover, had been conducting its own foreign operations in Latin America during the war and was reluctant to yield that ground. The early CIA operated in an environment of bureaucratic friction as well as geopolitical tension, and the two were not always easy to distinguish. The Office of Policy Coordination, created in 1948 to manage covert operations, was nominally part of the CIA, but was partly staffed and funded by the State Department and took guidance from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It was, in the characteristically American fashion of that moment, a committee masquerading as a spy service. Its director, Frank Wisner, was an energetic and sometimes reckless former OSS officer who threw himself into the work with a conviction that the Soviet threat was existential and that conventional diplomacy alone could not meet it. By 1950, CIA stations existed in most of the world's major capitals. They were small, they were understaffed, they were working with inadequate budgets, uncertain legal authorities, and a shortage of officers who actually knew the languages and cultures of the countries they were supposed to be operating in. But they were there. The machinery of American foreign intelligence had been assembled, however imperfectly, and it was running. The Korean War, which began in June of 1950, accelerated everything. The CIA's covert operations budget ballooned. Station staffs grew. The pressure to produce intelligence, to recruit agents, to influence events in countries that were suddenly on the front lines of the Cold War became enormous.
The first few years of CIA station work were years of improvisation and pressure and occasional brilliance, played out in the back corridors of foreign embassies while the world outside tried to figure out what kind of century it was living in. Section 4. Diplomatic Cover. The Gentleman's Fiction. There is a fiction at the heart of nearly every CIA station, and everyone who matters knows it is a fiction, and everyone agrees with a kind of elaborate mutual courtesy to pretend otherwise. The fiction is this: that the man on the third floor of the American embassy who is listed in the diplomatic registry as the second secretary for cultural affairs is actually a diplomat, that he spends his days promoting American art and literature and educational exchanges, that his interest in the local intelligentsia is entirely cultural, that his long evenings at receptions and dinner parties are in the service of promoting goodwill.
Everyone who matters in this context means the host government's intelligence service. They know. They have almost always known. They watch the embassy. They follow the people who come and go. They note which supposed diplomats have cars with extra mileage on them, which ones make phone calls at odd hours, which ones seem to have an inexplicable number of local contacts who work in sensitive ministries. They know, and the CIA knows that they know, and the CIA knows that they know that the CIA knows. This is the diplomatic fiction, and it is not quite a lie, because it is understood by all parties to be a kind of convention, a mutually agreed-upon arrangement that keeps the business of intelligence within manageable bounds. The convention worked in the early Cold War because it served everyone's interests in a particular way. The host country's intelligence service could monitor the CIA's officially covered officers with relative ease. They knew who they were dealing with. They knew the faces and the cars and the routines. This made their counterintelligence work tractable, which they preferred to the alternative, a CIA operating entirely through unofficial covers, people they could not identify and could not monitor. Better the devil you can see. The CIA, for its part, preferred official cover for reasons of its own. Diplomatic immunity was real and valuable. If an officially covered officer was caught doing something that the host government found unacceptable, the worst that typically happened was that he was declared persona non grata, packed his bags and flew home. Embarrassing, certainly, professionally damaging sometimes, but not life-ending, not prison-ending, not the kind of ending that ended in a cell in some foreign intelligence service's basement facility.
The covers in cells were artfully constructed. The State Department made available to the CIA a certain number of positions in its embassies around the world, positions with real diplomatic titles and real diplomatic functions that could be performed at a sufficiently plausible level. A CIA officer assigned to an embassy as a political officer would actually do some political reporting. He would attend some of the meetings, write some of the cables, appear at some of the official functions that his title required. He was not entirely fake. He was partly real and partly something else, and the partly real part was what made the whole construction hold together. The social world of the embassy was the operational environment, and it was in many ways an extraordinarily useful one. Embassies in foreign capitals exist at the intersection of every kind of power. Diplomats from every country, local government officials, military officers, businessmen, journalists, academics, intelligence officers from other services, both allied and hostile, also under their own various covers and pursuing their own various agendas. All of them circulating through the same cocktail parties, the same official receptions, the same dinners and lunches and casual encounters at the margins of public events. For a CIA officer with good social instincts and a patient disposition,
This environment was a garden. Every conversation was potentially a recruitment opportunity. Every new acquaintance was a potential source. The work looked like socializing, because in many ways it was socializing, but with a purpose that never went off duty. You held your drink and you smiled, and you asked questions, and you listened to the answers, and you filed away everything that might be useful. You noticed who drank too much and became indiscreet. You noticed who seemed unhappy in their posting, resentful of their superiors, sympathetic to American interests, ideologically restless. You noted it all and brought it back to the station and began the slow, patient process of turning an acquaintance into an asset. The cover story was not just for the benefit of the host government's intelligence service, it was for everyone. For the local taxi driver, for the restaurant owner, for the neighbors. The cover had to hold against casual scrutiny, because casual scrutiny was constant and came from all directions. A CIA officer under diplomatic cover lived inside his cover 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for the duration of his tour. It was not a costume, it was or had to become a second nature.
This is harder than it sounds. Not the lying part, or not just the lying part, the discipline of it, the constant vigilance required to maintain a coherent false identity across every interaction, every day, over months and years. The fatigue of never being entirely off duty, of monitoring your own conversation even when you are tired and would rather just say what you actually think, of remembering which version of yourself you are supposed to be in this particular context with this particular person. The men and women who did this well, who maintained their covers through years of foreign posting without a significant slip, were people of remarkable self-possession and considerable mental stamina. They were also, almost by definition, people who had made a fundamental peace with the idea of performing, day after day, a role that was not quite themselves. That is a particular kind of psychological accommodation, and not everyone could make it. Some couldn't. Some cracked under the pressure, or developed the kind of operational recklessness that comes from too many years of too much careful restraint. The history of early CIA stations includes both categories. Section 5. The Station Chief. Shadows with Titles. In every CIA station around the world, there was one person whose role was different from all the others. Not in the sense of doing more dangerous work, though sometimes they did. Not in the sense of being more deeply undercover, though sometimes they were. Different in the sense of authority and responsibility, and the particular weight that comes with being the person whose name appears in classified cables at the bottom of every significant decision. The Station Chief, the COS in agency shorthand, the person who ran the station.
In the major stations, the station chief in the early Cold War years was often one of the more significant American presences in a foreign country, even if almost no one outside a small circle knew it. He was the CIA's senior officer in the country. He managed the station's budget, which could be substantial. He oversaw the station's operations, which could be extensive. He reported directly to CIA headquarters in Washington, which in the early years meant a chain of command that ran through the Directorate of Plans and ultimately to the Director of Central Intelligence himself. He also had a relationship with the American ambassador that was, in the bureaucratic life of an embassy, perpetually complicated. The ambassador was the president's personal representative. He was, in theory, in charge of all American government activities in the country. He had the authority to direct and coordinate the activities of all official American personnel, including CIA personnel. In practice, the station chief operated with a degree of independence that sometimes created tension. He had his own chain of command, running back to Langley. He received instructions from Langley that were not always shared with the ambassador. He ran operations that the ambassador sometimes did not know about and occasionally did not want to know about. This tension was structural and permanent. It was built into the institutional arrangements of American foreign policy from the beginning, and it was never fully resolved. Some ambassadors worked closely and comfortably with their station chiefs, understanding that the CIA's information and capabilities were valuable assets. Others resented what they saw as a parallel government operating out of their embassy, pursuing agendas that were sometimes at cross purposes with official diplomatic goals. A few demanded to be briefed on everything and used that information to constrain CIA operations they found distasteful. Others, more common in the early years, simply preferred not to know. The station chief was also the CIA's primary liaison with the host country's intelligence service, if such a liaison existed. In friendly countries, this liaison relationship was explicit and collaborative. The CIA and the British MI6 worked closely together, sharing information, coordinating operations, occasionally running joint agents. In less allied countries, the liaison was more careful, more guarded, more attentive to the line between cooperation and exposure. A good station chief needed a particular combination of qualities. He needed operational instincts, the tradecraft intuition to recognize an opportunity and pursue it without overplaying it. He needed analytical judgment, the ability to assess the value of information and the reliability of the people providing it. He needed management skills, the ability to run a small organization of people doing difficult work under pressure. He needed political sensitivity, the ability to navigate the complicated bureaucratic landscape of an embassy. And he needed the social ease of the senior diplomat, the ability to move through the upper levels of a foreign country's political and social life without attracting the wrong kind of attention. Berlin had been the capital of Nazi Germany and was now divided into 4 occupation zones: the American, British and French sectors in the west, the Soviet sector in the east. The city sat deep inside the Soviet occupation zone of Germany, a western island in a communist sea, accessible to the west only through the air corridors and the autobahn that cut across East German territory. It was an arrangement of extraordinary strategic peculiarity, and it produced an intelligence environment of corresponding complexity. The CIA's presence in Berlin was formalized as the Berlin Operations Base, usually called BOB. It was one of the most important CIA stations in the world, and for good reason. Berlin was a place where you could, if you were patient and resourceful, meet and recruit people from across the Iron Curtain. East Germans moved through the city. Eastern European diplomats and officials came and went. Soviet military and intelligence personnel were present in large numbers. The sheer density of the intelligence target made Berlin unique. The Berlin Operations Base in the early 1950s was run by a sequence of formidable officers, but the name most associated with its most dramatic operation was William King Harvey. Harvey was an unusual figure in the CIA landscape of that period, a former FBI agent who had transferred to the CIA, physically imposing and personally eccentric, known for carrying a pistol even to official functions. He was also an exceptionally capable intelligence officer with a talent for large, complex operations and an appetite for the operational audacity that Berlin, more than almost anywhere else, seemed to invite. The audacity that Harvey and his colleagues achieved in Berlin was Operation Gold, known also by its British partner's designation, Operation Stopwatch. The idea was simple in conception and staggering in execution: to dig a tunnel from West Berlin into East Berlin, reaching underneath a Soviet communications cable that carried telephone and teleprinter traffic between Soviet military and intelligence headquarters in the East. If the tunnel could reach that cable, and if the cable could be tapped, the intelligence product could be transformative. The tunnel was nearly 500 meters long. It was dug in secret, beginning in late 1954, under the cover of a radar installation that was constructed in the American sector specifically to conceal the operation. The digging took months. The soil excavated, thousands of cubic yards of it, had to be removed without attracting attention. The tunnel was reinforced, air-conditioned, equipped with listening equipment and recording machinery of the most sophisticated kind available. It became operational in May of 1955. For nearly 11 months, American and British intelligence listened to thousands of conversations on the Soviet cables. The intelligence product was massive, enormous reels of tape, hundreds of analysts working to transcribe and translate and assess what had been captured. And then, in April of 1956, the Soviets dug down from the surface and discovered the tunnel. They announced the discovery publicly, staging a media event that was designed to embarrass the Western powers. They said nothing about how they had known where to look, because the reason they had known was one that they could not afford to publicize. A British intelligence officer named George Blake, who had been involved in the planning of the tunnel from the beginning, had been a Soviet agent all along. He had told the KGB about the tunnel before the first shovelful of dirt was turned. The Soviets had known about it for more than a year before they exposed it. They had decided to let it run because exposing it immediately would have revealed that they had a source inside the operation. Berlin continued to be the center of CIA operations in Germany for the entire Cold War. The construction of the Berlin Wall in August of 1961 changed the operational environment dramatically, closing off the fluid human movement through the city that had made it so rich an intelligence environment. But even afterward, even with the wall in place and the frontier hardened, Berlin remained a place where East and West faced each other across the shortest possible distance, where the work of intelligence was conducted with a proximity and an intensity found nowhere else. Section 7. Tehran. Oil, coups, and quiet rooms. The CIA station in Tehran has one of the most consequential histories of any station in the agency's existence, and much of that history was made in the space of a few months in 1953. But the station's roots go back further, to the wartime presence of OSS officers in a country that was, during the Second World War, an Anglo-Soviet occupation zone of considerable strategic importance. Iran sat at the hinge between the Soviet Union and the Persian Gulf, between Russian ambitions and British oil interests, between Central Asia and the warm water ports that every great power in the region's history had coveted. During the war, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union had all maintained military presences in Iran, using it as a supply corridor for Lend-Lease shipments to the Soviet Union. OSS officers had been present in Tehran almost from the beginning of American involvement, working under various covers, monitoring Soviet activities in the north and maintaining contact with the political landscape. After the war, the OSS became the CIA, and the CIA station in Tehran settled into the work of a Cold War posting. Iran was a constitutional monarchy under Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, a young and somewhat uncertain ruler who had come to the throne in 1941 at the age of 21. The country's politics were fractious and complicated, featuring a parliament with real power, a communist party called the Tudeh that had substantial support among the urban working class and the intelligentsia, and a rising tide of nationalist sentiment focused on the one issue that dominated everything else: oil. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, a British concern, had been extracting Iranian oil under concession terms that gave Iran a small fraction of the revenue generated by its own resources. Iranian resentment of this arrangement was deep and broadly shared across the political spectrum. In 1951, a nationalist politician named Mohammad Mossadegh was elected prime minister on a platform centered on nationalization of the oil industry. He had enormous popular support. He was articulate, passionate, and politically skilled. He nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and Britain, furious, imposed an oil embargo and began looking for ways to remove him. The CIA station in Tehran during this period was watching all of this carefully and reporting back to Washington. The Truman administration, for its part, was not initially inclined to support a British-engineered coup against a democratically elected government. Mossadegh was not a communist. The Tudeh party was communist, but Mossadegh was a nationalist, and Truman's people were not persuaded that deposing a nationalist in order to restore a British oil company's profits was either wise or just.
Then Eisenhower became president in January of 1953, and the calculation changed. The new administration was more receptive to the British argument that Mossadegh's government was creating conditions in which the communists could eventually take power. The CIA was given authorization to proceed with a plan jointly developed with British intelligence to remove Mossadegh from power. The first attempt in mid-August of 1953 failed. Mossadegh's security services got wind of it. The Shah, panicked, fled the country. It seemed for a moment that the operation had collapsed, but Roosevelt stayed. He continued to work his networks, continued to manage the street operation, continued to push. 4 days after the first attempt, the tide turned. Military units loyal to the coup moved. Mossadegh's forces were unable to hold. By August 19th, it was over. Mossadegh was arrested. The Shah returned. The CIA's operation had succeeded. The consequences of what happened in Tehran in August of 1953 are still being felt. The Shah's return to power, secured by American intervention, would shape Iranian politics for the next 26 years, ending in the Islamic Revolution of 1979, which was partly driven by the memory of 1953 and the deep Iranian resentment of American interference in their country's affairs. The CIA station in Tehran would be overrun in 1979, its archives seized, its offices taken hostage. The same operation that gave the CIA one of its great early covert action successes planted the seeds of one of its greatest later disasters. Section 8. The Art of Recruitment. Human Intelligence in Practice. The most important thing any CIA station does is recruit. Everything else, the cables, the covers, the safe houses, the dead drops, the cipher machines, all of it is infrastructure. The point of the infrastructure is to support and protect the single most valuable product in the intelligence business, a human being inside the target who is willing to tell you things.
Recruiting a foreign agent is not a simple transaction. It is not like hiring someone for a job, or at least it rarely is. It is more like the very slow development of a relationship, guided by one party who has a specific goal in mind, and conducted in an environment where the other party must never fully understand the nature of what is being asked until the moment of asking has been so carefully prepared that refusal feels impossible, or at least very difficult. The CIA officers who trained and practiced this art in the early Cold War years worked from a framework, never quite formalized into doctrine in those years, but understood intuitively by experienced officers, that has since been given the acronym MICE. The letters stand for money, ideology, compromise, and ego. These are the four primary motivations that lead a person to betray the secrets of their own government to a foreign intelligence service. Money is the most obvious. People need it. Some people need it very badly. And the CIA in the early Cold War years had access to resources that most foreign government officials could not easily resist. A mid-level official in a Soviet-aligned government who was struggling to pay his rent, or to fund his child's education, or to maintain a lifestyle that his salary could not quite support, was a potential vulnerability. The CIA officer who identified that vulnerability and approached it with patient generosity was practicing a form of applied psychology as old as espionage itself. Ideology was perhaps the most potent motivator in the Cold War context. The competition between communism and liberal democracy was genuinely felt as a moral competition by many of the people who lived on both sides of it. There were Soviet officials and East European intelligence officers who were privately disillusioned with what they had seen of communism in practice, who believed that the system they served was morally bankrupt, who were looking for a way to act on that belief. These were the agents who were most reliably productive, because their motivation was intrinsic and persistent, rather than contingent on the CIA's continued ability to pay. Compromise, the C in the acronym, referred to what intelligence services call in various languages by words that all mean roughly the same thing: blackmail. If a target could be identified as doing something that he could not afford to have known, an affair, a financial irregularity, a private deviation from the ideological orthodoxy of his government, that fact could become leverage. The CIA's use of compromise as a recruitment tool in the early years was real, but was also complicated by the obvious ethical and practical problems. An agent recruited through blackmail is a hostile and unreliable asset who will, at the first opportunity, either expose you or feed you fabricated information. Ego, the E, was sometimes the most interesting. Some people simply wanted to be important. They wanted to feel that their knowledge and their access mattered, that what they knew was significant enough that a great power's intelligence service was interested in them. For these people, the recruitment process was partly flattery, partly the cultivation of a sense of special significance. The CIA officer who could make a foreign official feel that his insights were uniquely valuable, that he was seen and appreciated in a way that his own government did not quite manage, was touching something deep and human and surprisingly common. The recruitment process in practice was slow and careful and proceeded through stages. It began with access, finding yourself in proximity to the target. Then came cultivation, the development of a relationship through repeated social contact, conversation, the establishment of trust and rapport and mutual liking, or at least its convincing simulation. Then came the developmental phase, in which the CIA officer began, very gently, very indirectly, to probe the target's attitudes, to explore the motivations that might make him susceptible, to create the emotional and psychological conditions in which a proposition might be received favorably. And then, finally, the pitch, the moment of explicit asking, carefully timed, carefully worded,
offering the target a way to understand what was being asked that aligned with his own self-image.
The pitch was the most delicate moment. If it was misjudged, if it came too early or too bluntly or to the wrong person, the consequences ranged from social awkwardness to immediate arrest. The officer who pitched a target who was actually a loyal citizen and who reported the approach to his government had just burned his cover and potentially compromised the station's entire network of relationships. The risk calculation that went into every pitch was one of the most consequential judgments an operations officer made. Section 9. Dead drops, brush passes, and signal sites, tradecraft in the field. Away from the reception halls and the dinner tables, away from the slow, patient work of cultivation and the delicate conversations of recruitment, there was another dimension to CIA station life, the physical mechanics of keeping secrets, the tradecraft, the practical techniques that allowed people who were supposed to have no connection to each other to exchange information without being seen doing it. These techniques were not invented by the CIA. They had been developed and refined over centuries of intelligence work by every service that had ever tried to communicate secretly in an environment where being observed meant being destroyed. What the CIA brought to them in the early Cold War years was a combination of the institutional memory of the OSS, the technical resources of a well-funded modern intelligence service, and the particular urgency of an environment in which the opposing Soviet intelligence services were extremely capable and extremely watchful. The dead drop was the most fundamental technique. It was a physical location known to both the CIA officer and the agent, where material could be left by one and retrieved by the other without the two ever meeting. The location could be almost anything: a particular loose brick in a wall, a hollow in a tree, a space beneath a specific park bench, a particular location in a public library where a document could be left between the pages of a specific book on a specific shelf. The beauty of the dead drop was that it eliminated the need for direct contact between the officer and the agent. Two people who were never seen together could still exchange information regularly with the dead drop as the medium. The loading and clearing of dead drops was governed by elaborate protocols designed to ensure that neither party was walking into a trap. Before loading a drop, you made sure you were not under surveillance. You checked your surroundings with a practiced casualness that was the opposite of obvious. Not that quick, anxious look around of someone who suspects they are being followed, but the unhurried, natural awareness of someone who has internalized surveillance detection as a way of moving through the world. You walked routes that gave you opportunities to observe your back trail. You made a turn and watched who turned after you. You stopped at a shop window and used the reflection to check the street behind you. These were called surveillance detection routes, or SDRs, and they were among the most important skills in a field officer's repertoire. An SDR was not a random walk. It was a choreographed sequence of movements designed to create opportunities to identify surveillance without alerting the surveillance to the fact that you were looking for it. You took a bus. You got off 2 stops early. You walked. You stopped for coffee. You walked again. The pattern looked like an ordinary day. It was a systematic check. The brush pass was a different technique for different circumstances. Where a dead drop was for situations where the material being exchanged could be left and retrieved without timing precision, a brush pass was for situations where the exchange needed to happen in real time, but without apparent contact. 2 people walked past each other on a busy street. As they crossed, a folded document or a small package passed from one hand to the other. Done well, it was invisible. A casual observer, watching the 2 people pass each other in a crowd, would see nothing. The motion was absorbed into the general blur of pedestrian traffic. Signal sites were a simpler version of the same idea. A chalk mark on a specific wall, a pin pushed into a specific telephone pole, a specific object left on a specific windowsill. These were signals rather than exchanges, ways of communicating binary information. The meeting is on, or abort the meeting. I have material for you, or I am under surveillance, without any direct contact or physical exchange. They required only that both parties knew the code and checked the site regularly. The hollow coin was one of the more celebrated physical tradecraft devices of the early Cold War period. A Soviet spy named Rudolf Abel, who was arrested by the FBI in New York in 1957, was found to be using a hollowed-out nickel to pass microfilm messages. The coin looked exactly like an ordinary coin and would pass casual inspection. Only a trained eye or a lucky accident like the one that exposed Abel when the coin was inadvertently spent and noticed by a newsboy would catch it. Microfilm and microdot technology allowed enormous quantities of information to be reduced to a physically tiny format, making documents that might otherwise fill a briefcase concealable in a cavity the size of a match head. CIA officers and agents in the field used these technologies to move information that could not be moved in any other way. A photograph of a classified document, reduced to microfilm, could be passed in a brush pass or left in a dead drop with negligible physical risk if discovered. All of this tradecraft, all of these techniques were at bottom in service of a single principle: creating a separation between the intelligence activity and the people conducting it, so that any individual element of the operation could be compromised without destroying the whole. If a dead drop was discovered, the officer and the agent were never at risk of being seen together. If a brush pass went wrong, the material that changed hands was all that was lost. The principle of compartmentalization, of keeping each element of an operation isolated from the others, was the underlying architecture of good intelligence work. There is a tier of CIA officer whose existence was, and in some contexts still is, one of the most closely held secrets of the American intelligence community. Not secret in the sense that no one knew they existed. Everyone in the intelligence world knew they existed. Secret in the sense that their individual identities were protected with a ferocity that went well beyond the ordinary protections afforded to officially covered officers. These were the non-official cover officers, the NOCs. While the vast majority of CIA officers posted overseas operated under diplomatic cover, with the protection of embassy affiliation and the safety net of diplomatic immunity, the NOCs had none of that. They had no connection to any American government institution that would be visible to any outside observer. They were, on paper and in practice, entirely private citizens. They worked for companies that existed, at least on the surface, genuine-seeming businesses with real addresses and real telephone numbers and real letterheads, supported by the CIA's elaborate cover construction capability. They paid taxes, obtained visas, lived in apartments, opened bank accounts, all in the identities the CIA had built for them. If they were caught, there was no diplomatic immunity, no persona non grata and a quiet flight home. If a NOC was caught doing intelligence work in a foreign country, he was subject to that country's laws, as any civilian would be. In countries with harsh legal systems, or in countries where the government was actively hostile to the United States, this meant the possibility of prison for years, or worse. This was understood. It was accepted. It was built into the terms of the NOC's service. The officers who chose this path, and it was always a choice, did so with a clear understanding of what they were risking. The question was always whether the operational advantages of the NOC's deeper cover justified those risks. In many cases, the answer was yes. The officially covered CIA officer, the cultural attaché, the second secretary, was identifiable to any competent counterintelligence service. His face was in the files. His presence at the embassy was noted. When he went to a meeting, there was a reasonable probability that he was being watched, because the KGB or the Stasi, or whatever local counterintelligence service was active in that country, had his name and his face, and they watched embassy personnel as a matter of routine. The NOC moved in a different world. He was not in the files. He was not associated with any government building. He attended different social events, moved in different circles, made contact with people who would not have been accessible to an embassy officer. He could go places and do things and meet people that were entirely outside the reach of official cover operations.
The construction of a NOC cover was an enormous undertaking. It required months or years of preparation before the officer was deployed. A legend, the intelligence term for a false biographical history, had to be built that would withstand serious scrutiny. Not just the surface details, a name and a passport and a business card, but the deep structure, tax records, employment history, references from previous jobs, educational credentials that could be checked. The CIA maintained teams of specialists, what was informally called the cover staff, whose entire job was the construction and maintenance of these false identities. The psychological demands of NOC work were extraordinary. An officially covered officer, for all the discipline his cover required, went back to the embassy every day. He was surrounded by colleagues who knew who he really was. He had access to CIA communications facilities, to support staff, to the institutional warmth of an organization that acknowledged his existence. The NOC had none of this. He was, for the duration of his posting, alone in the deepest professional sense of the word. His CIA contact might be a single handler whom he met rarely, using a communication protocol that might involve nothing more personal than a dead drop in a foreign city. He could not tell his friends who he really was. Sometimes he could not tell his family. The isolation was not just social, it was existential. The NOC lived with a divided consciousness that was more radical than anything the officially covered officer experienced. He was not merely performing a role while remaining himself underneath. He had to become, at a very deep level, the person his cover described. He had to inhabit that person's history, that person's professional knowledge, that person's social networks and habits and ways of talking about himself. The line between the cover and the person wearing it became, over years, genuinely blurry. Former NOCs who have spoken about their experiences describe a particular kind of disorientation upon returning to their real lives after long deployments. The cover, which had been so carefully constructed and so thoroughly inhabited, did not simply dissolve upon return. It lingered. It shadowed the re-emergence of the real self. Some officers found the transition deeply difficult. The years of performing had left their mark on who they actually were. Section 11. The Cable Traffic. Coded Whispers Across Oceans. Every CIA station in the world, every day that it was operational, sent cables to headquarters. And every day, headquarters sent cables back. This flow of encrypted communication was the circulatory system of the American intelligence establishment, the medium through which the stations and the center stayed connected, through which intelligence was transmitted and analyzed and acted upon,
through which orders were given and acknowledged and executed.
The cable was the fundamental unit of station communication, not a letter, which was too slow and too potentially interceptable, not a telephone call, which was even more vulnerable. A cable, a brief, carefully composed message encrypted before transmission and decrypted upon receipt, sent over the cables and then the radio links and eventually the satellite connections that tied the CIA's global network together. The encryption systems used by the CIA in the early Cold War were among the most closely guarded technical secrets the agency possessed. The one-time pad, the theoretical gold standard of cryptographic security, was used for the most sensitive communications. A one-time pad was exactly what its name suggested, a set of random key sequences, used once and never repeated, that made the encrypted message theoretically unbreakable by any analytical method, since without the matching pad there was no pattern to attack. The pads had to be physically produced, physically distributed, and then physically destroyed after use, which made them logistically complicated in proportion to their security. The cipher machines that supplemented manual encryption were the KL7 and its predecessors, electromechanical devices about the size of a typewriter that encrypted text automatically. An operator typed the plain text message, and the machine produced an encrypted output that bore no recognizable relationship to the input. At the receiving end, a matching machine with the correct key settings reversed the process. These machines were considerably faster than manual pad encryption and were used for the high volume of routine cable traffic that flowed between stations and headquarters. The physical security of the communications room within a CIA station was paramount. It was invariably the most hardened room in the station's physical footprint. The cipher machines were kept in vaults. Access was restricted to cleared personnel. The room was checked regularly for listening devices, a precaution that never became routine because the consequences of a compromised cipher room were too severe to permit routinized complacency. The cables themselves followed a format that was standard across the CIA's global network. A message number, a date-time group, a classification level, a distribution list indicating who at headquarters was authorized to read it. Then the text, composed in the particular dense, abbreviated prose of official cable traffic, compressed, precise, stripped of anything that was not absolutely necessary. Writing a cable was a skill that took time to develop. You learned to say in 50 words what might otherwise take 500, without sacrificing the nuance that the recipients needed to understand the situation. The incoming cables were the other side of the rhythm. Every morning in the station, someone checked the overnight traffic, the messages that had arrived from headquarters during the local night, and distributed them to the relevant offices. Some were informational, updates on the broader intelligence picture that gave context to local operations. Some were operational guidance, adjustments to ongoing programs or approval for proposed activities. Some were urgent instructions requiring immediate action. Some were queries, requests for information on specific topics that analysts at headquarters needed to fill gaps in their understanding. The pace of cable traffic was relentless. A major station like the one in Berlin or Tehran in the early 1950s might handle dozens of cables a day in each direction. Each one required attention, response, filing. The administrative burden of maintaining this flow while also conducting actual operations was one of the constant pressures of station life, and it fell most heavily on the communications officers and the station administrative staff who kept the whole system functioning. There were also the couriers. For material that was too sensitive or too voluminous to transmit electronically, physical courier runs carried documents and film and equipment between stations and headquarters.
The CIA maintained a courier service whose operations were as carefully managed as any other aspect of station security. Couriers traveled under diplomatic cover, their pouches protected by international convention from search by foreign customs or security services. Section 12. Propaganda, Influence, and the Press. Covert Information Operations. Not all of what CIA stations did in the early Cold War was espionage in the traditional sense of collecting secrets. A large and, in those years, enormously funded part of CIA station activity was what the agency called covert action. And a central element of covert action was information operations, the attempt to shape, influence, and, when necessary, fabricate the information environment in target countries.
This work was organizationally housed in the Office of Policy Coordination, the semi-autonomous covert action arm that Frank Wisner ran with considerable energy and considerable resources. By the early 1950s, the OPC's budget was growing faster than any other element of the CIA's expanding operation, and a substantial portion of that budget went into what Wisner called political warfare. The use of media, propaganda, cultural organizations, and political influence to compete with Soviet active measures on the ideological terrain of the Cold War. The most visible manifestation of this effort was Radio Free Europe, which began broadcasting to Eastern Europe in 1950, and Radio Liberty, which targeted Soviet audiences beginning in 1953. Both were officially independent private organizations, funded by voluntary donations from concerned American citizens, and organized by émigré communities who cared passionately about conditions in their home countries. This was the public story, and it was entirely false. Both organizations were funded covertly by the CIA from the beginning, through a network of foundation cutouts that concealed the government's involvement. At the station level, information operations took a more granular form. Station officers in foreign capitals cultivated relationships with local journalists, editors, and media proprietors who were sympathetic to American interests or susceptible to American money. Through these relationships, the CIA was able to place stories, sometimes accurate, sometimes shaped or embellished, in local newspapers and broadcast outlets, contributing to the information environment of the country in ways that served American policy goals. Cultural operations accompanied the media work. The CIA funded, through the Congress for Cultural Freedom and a network of other front organizations, a remarkable array of artistic and intellectual activity: literary magazines, music festivals, art exhibitions, scholarly conferences. The goal was partly to demonstrate the cultural vitality of the liberal democratic world, in contrast to the sterility of socialist realism, partly to build relationships with intellectuals in Western Europe and the developing world who might otherwise have drifted toward communist sympathies, partly to create a cultural infrastructure through which American influence could flow in forms that felt organic rather than official. Some of the most distinguished literary magazines of the Cold War era, journals that published serious work by serious writers, were covertly funded by the CIA. The writers and editors who contributed to these publications were often unaware of the funding source. When the funding was exposed in 1967, the revelation was a significant scandal that damaged many of the relationships the program had been designed to build. Section 13. Tokyo and the Far East, watching the Eastern Horizon. If Berlin was the most intense Cold War CIA station environment in Europe, Tokyo and the broader network of Far Eastern stations presented a different kind of complexity. The Second World War had ended differently in Asia.
Japan had surrendered unconditionally in August of 1945 and was now under American occupation, which meant that the CIA's presence there was initially entangled with MacArthur's military occupation administration in ways that created their own bureaucratic complications. Korea, China, the entire vast landscape of Asia was in motion, and the CIA stations in the region were trying to make sense of a situation that was moving faster than they could track.
The CIA station in Tokyo was established in the late 1940s under conditions very different from the European stations. Japan was not a neutral host country or an allied power in the Cold War sense. It was an occupied country, and the occupation administration under General Douglas MacArthur was deeply reluctant to have any intelligence organization operating in Japan that was not under MacArthur's control. MacArthur had his own intelligence apparatus, commanded by a controversial figure named General Charles Willoughby, and Willoughby was famously hostile to what he saw as CIA encroachment on his territory. The early CIA station in Tokyo consequently operated in an environment of tension not just with the Soviets or with the nascent communist world, but with the American military command. Officers who arrived to establish the CIA's independent intelligence capability found themselves navigating a bureaucratic minefield as well as a geopolitical one. MacArthur's command controlled access to Japanese contacts, to government officials, to the military and police networks that were the natural recruitment ground for intelligence work. The problem was solved largely by the Korean War. When North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel in June of 1950, the entire American intelligence architecture in the Far East was reorganized under the pressure of actual conflict. The CIA's role in the region expanded rapidly. Stations were established or reinforced in Seoul, in Hong Kong, in the Philippines, where an ongoing communist insurgency made intelligence work both urgent and dangerous. Japan became an operational hub, a staging ground and support base for CIA activities across the region. Hong Kong, then a British colony, was an exceptional intelligence environment. It was one of the few places in the world where genuine access to mainland China remained possible, even after Mao's victory in 1949. Chinese refugees, businessmen, academics, former nationalist government officials all passed through Hong Kong, and a patient intelligence officer with good language skills and a good network could learn a great deal about conditions inside China, which had otherwise become almost entirely opaque to American intelligence. The CIA station in Hong Kong maintained this particular focus throughout the 1950s and beyond, as the mainland became what the intelligence community called a denied area, a place where official American presence was impossible and unofficial presence was extraordinarily dangerous. The problem of China was perhaps the defining intelligence challenge of the early CIA's Far Eastern operations. After Mao's victory, the United States had no diplomatic presence on the mainland. The CIA had no stations, no officially covered offices, no embassy infrastructure to work from. Intelligence on China had to come from the margins, from Hong Kong and Taiwan, and the occasional asset who could be cultivated through third country intermediaries. This was thin cover for an enormous, increasingly powerful country. The CIA attempted to address this deficit through covert paramilitary operations that were, in retrospect, some of the most ill-conceived activities of the early Cold War period. Nationalist Chinese soldiers were trained and equipped for operations on the Chinese mainland. Agent teams were inserted by parachute and by sea. The results were almost universally disastrous. The teams were discovered, captured, killed. The mainland was simply too well controlled, the communist security apparatus too efficient for these operations to succeed at any significant scale.
Southeast Asia was another theater of early CIA activity, and another case where the initial operations contained the seeds of much larger subsequent disasters. The CIA station in Saigon was tracking the developing war in Indochina, between the French colonial administration and Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh forces. The United States was providing financial support to the French effort, and the CIA was providing intelligence and increasingly operational support. The fall of Dien Bien Phu in 1954 and the subsequent Geneva Accords that divided Vietnam would eventually draw the United States into the most consequential disaster of its Cold War foreign policy. But in the early 1950s, the CIA station in Saigon was a relatively small operation, watching a war that seemed to be someone else's problem. Section 14. Liaison relationships, the quiet alliances. No CIA station operated in isolation. Part of what gave the American intelligence community its reach and its capabilities in the early Cold War years was its network of relationships with the intelligence services of allied and friendly governments. These relationships, which the CIA called liaison, were among the most delicate and most productive elements of station work, and they required skills that were different from, but complementary to, the skills of unilateral intelligence operations. The most important and most extensive liaison relationship in the early CIA's existence was with the British intelligence services, the Secret Intelligence Service, known as MI6 or SIS, and the Government Communications Headquarters, the Signals Intelligence Agency. This relationship had its origins in the wartime collaboration between OSS and SIS, and it was reinstituted, formalized, and deepened in the early Cold War years through a series of agreements that gave each party substantial access to the other's intelligence collection and analysis.
The British brought things to the relationship that the Americans in the early years lacked. MI6 had decades of experience operating in parts of the world where the CIA was new and inexperienced. British officers had deep knowledge of the Middle East, of South Asia, of parts of Africa and Southeast Asia, where British imperial connections had maintained a long intelligence presence. They had language capabilities, cultural knowledge, and established networks that the CIA's relatively young cadre of officers could not replicate quickly. The Americans brought resources, money, technical capabilities, the enormous infrastructure of American governmental power. The CIA's budget, even in its early years, was larger than anything the British services could deploy. American technical intelligence capabilities, the U-2 aircraft program, the early satellite reconnaissance programs, the vast signals intelligence apparatus of the NSA, gave the CIA collection capabilities that vastly exceeded anything MI6 could field. The relationship was close and genuine, and also, as all intelligence liaison relationships are, tinged with mutual wariness. You shared with your allies the things you wanted them to know and the things you needed their help to acquire. You did not share everything, because an allied intelligence service was still a foreign intelligence service with its own national interests and its own institutional loyalties. You operated on a sliding scale of trust that was calibrated by the specific intelligence domain, the specific country, and the specific operation.
The Berlin Tunnel operation was a joint CIA-MI6 project, and it illustrated both the depth and the limits of the alliance. The two services collaborated so closely on the planning and execution that British officers worked alongside American officers throughout the construction phase. But the penetration of the planning by George Blake, the British intelligence officer who was secretly working for the Soviets, was a British problem that the British service did not detect, and it compromised an operation that both services had invested enormous effort in building. The liaison worked brilliantly at the technical level and failed catastrophically at the counterintelligence level. The CIA also maintained liaison relationships with the intelligence services of other Allied countries. The West Germans had the BND, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, established by the CIA-affiliated Gehlen organization, a network of former German military intelligence officers who had been recruited by the Americans immediately after the war. Reinhard Gehlen had been the head of German military intelligence on the Eastern Front during the war, and his organization had extensive files and extensive networks in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. The CIA had essentially purchased this network, providing Gehlen with funding and operational support in exchange for access to his intelligence. The BND became the Federal Republic of Germany's foreign intelligence service, and it maintained its close CIA relationship throughout the Cold War. With the Israeli intelligence service, the Mossad, the CIA maintained a relationship that was particularly close in its early years, and that centered on shared intelligence about Soviet activities in the Middle East and about the Arab states surrounding Israel. Israel's geographic position and its particular intelligence capabilities made it a valuable partner in ways that went well beyond what the two countries' formal diplomatic relationship might have suggested.
The liaison relationships also extended to less obvious partners. Intelligence services in Asia, Africa, and Latin America that were willing to cooperate with American interests were courted, funded, trained, and equipped. The CIA's liaison activities in these relationships sometimes crossed from intelligence cooperation into something closer to the management of client services, where the distinction between collaboration and control became genuinely blurry. Section 15. Failures, Exposure, and the Cost of Discovery. There is a kind of history that intelligence services are reluctant to write, the history of failure, of operations that went wrong, of agents who were captured or killed, of covers that broke at the worst possible moment, of plans that seemed sound and turned out to be catastrophically flawed. The CIA's early Cold War station history includes its share of this darker material, and some of it was very dark indeed. The operations against Albania were among the most painful early failures. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the CIA and MI6, working through the exile communities that had fled communist rule, attempted to infiltrate trained agent teams into Albania, to build resistance networks, and eventually, it was hoped, to destabilize the communist government. The teams were trained, equipped, and inserted. Almost all of them were captured almost immediately upon arrival. The communist security forces in Albania seemed to know where the teams were coming and when they were expected.
They knew because Kim Philby knew. Philby was the British intelligence officer who coordinated the Albanian operation on the British side. He was also, as it would eventually emerge, a Soviet agent of long standing, one of the celebrated Cambridge Five, who had been recruited by Soviet intelligence while at Cambridge University in the 1930s. Philby had attended the planning meetings, had known the insertion schedules, had known everything about the teams that were being sent in. He reported all of it to his Soviet handlers. The Albanian security services were waiting. The human cost of these operations was never fully established publicly. The men who were sent in were Albanians who had risked everything on the promise that Western intelligence would give them a chance to fight for their country's freedom. They were captured, tried, and in many cases executed. The intelligence services that had sent them in, that had trained them and equipped them and put them on the boats and the aircraft that delivered them to their deaths, have never fully accounted for what they knew, and when they knew it, about the penetrations that made these operations suicidal from the start. The CIA's agent networks in Eastern Europe experienced similar systematic failures. Teams parachuted into Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, the Baltic states. The Soviet and satellite security services, many of them working with information provided by penetration agents in Western intelligence, were waiting. The proportion of teams that survived their insertions intact and produced useful intelligence was distressingly small. The proportion that were captured, turned, and used to feed disinformation back to the CIA was larger than anyone wanted to acknowledge. George Blake's betrayal of the Berlin Tunnel was exposed eventually, but the damage was far larger than the tunnel alone. Blake had been in positions that gave him knowledge of numerous CIA and MI6 operations, numerous agents, numerous station arrangements. When the full scope of his betrayal was assessed, the conclusion was that he had compromised an enormous amount of what both services had built over years. The exposure of CIA station officers through counterintelligence failures had consequences not just for the officers themselves, but for the agents who had been recruited and run by those officers. An agent whose CIA connection was compromised faced dangers that no diplomatic immunity could address. He was a citizen of his own country, subject to his own country's laws, and the penalty for espionage in the Soviet Union or its satellite states was death, or its practical equivalent, years in conditions designed to break the will and the body of the people subjected to them. CIA officers who lost agents to compromise carried that weight. Some talked about it in later years, some never did. The agency itself was not good, in the early years or in many subsequent years, at formally acknowledging the cost of operational failures or at institutionalizing the lessons those failures contained. The culture of the Directorate of Operations tended to treat failures as anomalies and successes as the norm, which was not always accurate, but which reflected the psychological needs of people doing work that required a fundamental optimism about the utility of what they were doing.
The failure mode that perhaps most damaged the CIA's credibility in its early years was not any individual operational disaster, but a systemic one. The failure to detect the Soviet intelligence penetrations that undermined so many operations before they could succeed. The CIA was not unique in this vulnerability. Every major Western intelligence service was penetrated at some level by Soviet intelligence in the early Cold War years. But the damage was real, the consequences were severe, and the reckoning was painful when it finally came. What the early stations had built in those first 15 years of the agency's existence was the infrastructure of American intelligence presence around the world. The relationships, the networks, the institutional arrangements with foreign services, the physical presence in embassies and safe houses and office buildings in dozens of countries. This infrastructure would endure, expand, contract, adapt, and occasionally be destroyed and rebuilt. But the basic architecture, the idea of the CIA station as the permanent American intelligence presence in a foreign capital, operating under diplomatic cover, conducting human intelligence collection and covert action, reporting to Langley, managing liaison relationships with local services. This architecture was established in the early years, and it persisted. The legacy of the early stations is genuinely mixed in ways that any honest accounting has to acknowledge. The intelligence successes were real. Agents recruited in the early Cold War stations provided information that shaped American policy in consequential ways, that warned of dangers that might otherwise have been missed, that gave American policymakers insights into the intentions and capabilities of adversaries who would otherwise have been entirely opaque. The human intelligence networks built in those years were among the most important tools the United States had in the Cold War competition. The covert action record was more complicated. The coup in Iran in 1953, which seemed like a clean success at the time, planted the seeds of a catastrophic deterioration of American-Iranian relations that would bear its most bitter fruit in 1979, and that has never been fully repaired. Operations in Guatemala, in the Congo, in Chile, and in numerous other countries where the CIA's early stations set patterns of intervention that the later stations followed, produced outcomes that are still contested by historians and still felt by the people of the countries involved. The arrogance implicit in the idea that American intelligence officers could and should determine the political outcomes of foreign countries, that democracy was too important to be left to Democrats if the Democrats were making the wrong choices, this arrogance had consequences that extended far beyond the Cold War. The men and women who staffed the early stations were, with some exceptions, people of genuine patriotic conviction who believed that what they were doing mattered, that the Soviet threat was real, and the work of containing it was necessary. They were not wrong about the threat. They were sometimes wrong about the methods. They were sometimes used by policymakers to do things that were less about intelligence and more about politics, and less about national security and more about ideological preference and economic interest. They operated in a system that gave them enormous latitude and insufficient oversight, and some of them used that latitude in ways that should make any honest observer uncomfortable.
The world that the early CIA stations helped to make was the world that the Cold War made, and the Cold War is over, and that world has passed. The stations remain. The tradecraft has evolved. The technology has transformed the mechanics of intelligence work beyond anything that the officers of the late 1940s could have imagined. But some things have not changed. There are still small rooms in embassies around the world where people are doing things that do not appear in any official directory. There are still officers undercover, building relationships with patient care, doing the slow work of learning what foreign governments and foreign actors are actually thinking behind the official statements and the public positions. The diplomatic fiction persists. The embassy still hums with ordinary business during the day. The flag still flies. The visa clerks still stamp passports without looking up. And somewhere on an upper floor, behind a door that looks like all the other doors, a station is open for business. On the physical life of a station officer. There is a version of the CIA officer's life that exists in popular imagination, and a version that existed in fact, and they share a family resemblance without being the same thing. The popular version involves fast cars, beautiful contacts, and the constant electric tension of imminent physical danger. The factual version involves more paperwork.
A CIA station officer in the early Cold War on an ordinary Tuesday in, say, Vienna or Athens or Mexico City woke early. He dressed in the clothes appropriate to whatever his cover required, a diplomat's suit, or the more casual attire of a business consultant, or the tweedy approximation of an academic. He ate breakfast, usually at home, usually quickly. If he was running a surveillance detection route before a meeting, he needed to be moving before the city's morning rush made the routes too crowded to read properly. The SDR, the surveillance detection route, was not optional and not abbreviated. An officer who shortened his SDR because he was running late, or because the weather was bad, or because he had convinced himself that the meeting was low risk, was an officer making a mistake. The discipline of the SDR was the same as the discipline of any security protocol. It only worked if it was applied consistently, every time, regardless of circumstances. The one time you shortened it would be the one time you should not have. If the route was clean, he would proceed to the meeting location. The meeting itself, if it was with an established agent, might last 30 minutes or 2 hours, depending on how much the agent had to report and how much the officer needed to convey. The conversation was conducted in whatever language the two shared, in whatever setting was appropriate to their cover story for being together: a cafe, a park, the back room of a shop, a car driven through unfamiliar streets.
The officer was listening and remembering, and occasionally guiding the conversation towards specific topics, while simultaneously monitoring the environment around them, watching for anything that suggested observation.
After the meeting, another route. The officer needed to establish surveillance-free travel away from the meeting location before returning to any official American facility. If he had received physical material from the agent, document photographing would need to happen before those documents could be returned. If he had arranged a future meeting, the specific arrangements needed to be committed to memory. Nothing related to operational activity was written down before the officer was in a secure location. Back at the embassy, or back at a safe house, the debriefing happened. The writing of a cable that would carry the information obtained in the meeting back to headquarters. Cable writing was a craft. The officer needed to convey not just the raw information the agent had provided, but his own assessment of its reliability, his sense of the agent's current state of mind and commitment, any operational security concerns that had arisen, and any recommendations for follow-on action. All of this in the compressed, precise language of cable traffic, stripped of anything extraneous. Then the next task, the next cable to answer, the next contact to cultivate, the next source development meeting to prepare for, the next intelligence requirement from headquarters to address. The day was long, and the work was dense, and the rewards were frequently invisible and delayed, because intelligence work of this kind produced its results not in the immediate transaction, but in the accumulated understanding of months and years. The fatigue was real. Not just the physical fatigue of long days and disrupted sleep, and the constant alertness that good field work required. The cognitive and emotional fatigue of the life itself, the weight of maintaining a cover, the isolation of work that could not be discussed with anyone outside the station, the moral weight of a job that required you to use people, to cultivate relationships for instrumental purposes, to ask of your agents things that could get them killed. Some officers found the work deeply satisfying in ways that made the fatigue bearable. They believed in what they were doing, believed that the intelligence they produced mattered, believed that the sources they ran were safer because of the care they brought to the work. Others found, over years, that the work had taken something from them that they could not entirely name or get back. On the foreign cities themselves. The cities where the early CIA stations operated were not interchangeable. Each one had its own texture, its own particular quality of light and danger and opportunity. And the best CIA officers understood that operating effectively in a foreign city required a genuine knowledge of that city, not just a surface familiarity, but a deep inhabiting of its rhythms and its social geography. Vienna, in the late 1940s and early 1950s, was one of the great Cold War intelligence environments of Europe. The city was divided, like Berlin, into 4 occupation zones, but unlike Berlin, it remained a genuinely international city, a crossroads where East and West continued to meet in ways that the hardening of the Iron Curtain elsewhere had foreclosed. The Soviets maintained a large presence. The British, French, and Americans each had their zones and their intelligence operations. Neutral Austria was a place where contacts could be made, where defectors could surface, where the intelligence landscape had a richness and complexity that made it endlessly productive for a patient observer. The cafes of Vienna were not just cafes. Every cafe in the city's center had its regular clientele, its known political colorings, its social network of journalists and intellectuals and government officials, and the various kinds of people who circulate in the ambiguous spaces between official and unofficial life. An intelligence officer who spent months in those cafes, who learned the regulars and the rhythms and the particular conversational culture of each establishment, had access to a social map of the city that was itself a form of intelligence. Mexico City was different. It was one of the largest cities in the Western Hemisphere, a churning metropolis where the Cold War's Latin American theater played out against a backdrop of extraordinary social complexity. The CIA station there was one of the most active in the hemisphere, involved in monitoring Soviet and Cuban diplomatic and intelligence activities, tracking left-wing political movements, and running operations that fed into the broader American policy objectives in Latin America. The city's social geography offered unusual opportunities. The diplomatic community was large and cosmopolitan, with representatives from every country and every ideology. The intellectual and artistic life of the city was vibrant and politically engaged in ways that created natural entry points for intelligence operations. The Soviet embassy maintained a substantial intelligence presence. Cuban intelligence was active. The CIA station tracked, cultivated, and when possible, recruited across this entire landscape. Beirut in the 1950s and into the 1960s was a different world again. The Paris of the Middle East, as it was sometimes called, with a degree of accuracy that the subsequent decades would render bitterly ironic. A sophisticated, cosmopolitan city of considerable beauty, with a banking sector and a free press and a social scene that attracted businessmen, journalists, diplomats, and intelligence officers from every part of the world. The CIA station there was one of the most productive in the Middle East, working the intersection of Arab politics, Palestinian questions, the regional Cold War competition with the Soviet Union, and the particular intelligence opportunities offered by a city that remained, for a few decades, genuinely open. The CIA of the late 1940s and early 1950s was staffed by a particular social cohort that has since become something of a historical type. The Ivy League educated, liberal arts trained, socially connected establishment figure who brought to intelligence work the combination of patriotic conviction, personal confidence, and occasionally dangerous cultural narrowness that characterized his class. These were the men, and they were overwhelmingly men, who had attended Yale and Princeton and Harvard, who had spent their wartime years in OSS stations in Europe and Asia, who had come back convinced that the fight against totalitarianism was the defining challenge of their generation, and that the intelligence profession was a worthy arena for continuing that fight. Frank Wisner, who ran the Covert Action Program with such energy in the early years, was a Mississippian by birth, but a Wall Street lawyer and OSS veteran by formation. Richard Helms, who would eventually become Director of Central Intelligence, was a former journalist and OSS man, whose operational instincts and institutional intelligence made him one of the most consequential figures in the agency's history. Alan Dulles, who became the CIA's longest-serving director, brought to the job the same cultivated social ease and the same gift for the cultivation of trust that had served him so well in Bern. These men were not, as a group, cynics. They were idealists of a particular kind, people who believed that American power was, on balance, a force for good in the world, that the Soviet system was genuinely threatening to everything they valued, and that the instrument of intelligence was an honorable tool in the service of those beliefs. They were sometimes naive about the limits of covert action. They were sometimes too willing to pursue short-term operational successes at the cost of long-term consequences they did not foresee. But the cliched portrait of them as cynical manipulators casually destroying foreign democracies for corporate profit is as false as the romantic portrait of them as infallible knights of American security.
The reality was more mundane and more interesting. They were people doing difficult work in a genuinely dangerous situation, making judgment calls under uncertainty, operating with inadequate information and contradictory instructions, and getting it right sometimes and wrong sometimes, as people in all difficult work always do. On counterintelligence, the paranoid discipline. Every CIA station was haunted by counterintelligence. The question that never went away, that could never be entirely answered, that had the potential to invalidate years of work with a single piece of information. Who had gotten inside? Counterintelligence is the discipline of protecting your own operations against penetration by the opposition. It is, in some ways, the mirror image of intelligence collection. Where the intelligence collector asks, "How do I get inside the other side's secrets?" the counterintelligence officer asks, "How is the other side trying to get inside mine?" It requires a particular cast of mind, one that tends toward suspicion, toward the identification of patterns that suggest hostile activity, toward the assumption that any operation or relationship that seems too productive might be too productive for innocent reasons. The CIA's counterintelligence program in the early years was run for a long period by James Jesus Angleton, one of the most consequential and most controversial figures in the agency's history. Angleton was a former OSS officer who had spent the war in Italy and had developed in the post-war years an extraordinarily close relationship with Kim Philby, whom he regarded as one of the most brilliant intelligence minds he had ever encountered. When Philby was eventually exposed as a Soviet agent in 1963, the revelation hit Angleton with the force of a personal betrayal as well as a professional one.
From that point on, Angleton's counterintelligence program was shaped by a conviction that the CIA had been penetrated deeply, that Soviet active measures were far more sophisticated and far more successful than anyone wanted to acknowledge, that almost any Soviet defector who offered to provide intelligence was either a plant or had been turned. This conviction, carried to the logical extreme it eventually reached under Angleton's direction, produced a counterintelligence program that was more damaging to the CIA's own operations than any Soviet penetration could have been. Genuine Soviet defectors were subjected to years of hostile interrogation that left them broken. CIA officers with legitimate Eastern European connections were suspected and their careers destroyed. The counterintelligence function, which existed to protect the agency, became a source of enormous institutional damage. Angleton's story is, in miniature, the story of one of the fundamental tensions in intelligence work. The tension between the necessary suspicion of the counterintelligence mind and the operational openness required to actually produce intelligence. Too little suspicion and you get penetrated. Too much and you destroy yourself from inside. Finding the balance was and is one of the hardest things intelligence institutions have to do. From that point on, Angleton's counterintelligence program was shaped by a conviction that the CIA had been penetrated deeply,
that Soviet active measures were far more sophisticated and far more successful than anyone wanted to acknowledge. That almost any Soviet defector who offered to provide intelligence was either a plant or had been turned. This conviction, carried to the logical extreme it eventually reached under Angleton's direction, produced a counterintelligence program that was more damaging to the CIA's own operations than any Soviet penetration could have been. Genuine Soviet defectors were subjected to years of hostile interrogation that left them broken. CIA officers with legitimate Eastern European connections were suspected and their careers destroyed. The counterintelligence function, which existed to protect the agency, became a source of enormous institutional damage. Angleton's story is, in miniature, the story of one of the fundamental tensions in intelligence work. The tension between the necessary suspicion of the counterintelligence mind and the operational openness required to actually produce intelligence. Too little suspicion and you get penetrated.
The early CIA foreign stations were not what the hagiographers of the intelligence world have described them as being, or not just that. They were not seamless instruments of American power, staffed by brilliant and infallible professionals who outmaneuvered the Soviets at every turn. They failed as often as they succeeded, and some of their failures were catastrophic. They were penetrated, manipulated, and deceived. They undertook operations whose consequences they could not foresee and would not have chosen if they could. They were also not what the harshest critics have described them as being: cynical engines of American imperialism, casually destroying the sovereignty of foreign countries in service of corporate interests or ideological obsession. The people who staffed them were, for the most part, people of genuine conviction, doing genuinely difficult work in genuinely dangerous conditions. The failures were often failures of judgment in hard situations, not failures of basic decency. What they were, most of all, was human, subject to the limitations of human intelligence and human foresight and human bureaucratic dysfunction, capable of the particular kind of moral compromise that institutions under pressure always seem to find their way to, capable also of the particular kind of courage and dedication that the same kinds of pressure sometimes produce. The cities where they operated have changed. Vienna is a peaceful, prosperous, thoroughly post-Cold War city. Tehran is something the officers of the 1950s station could not have imagined. Berlin is reunified, the wall gone, the tunnel site now a tourist attraction. The old safe houses have been remodeled or demolished. The cipher rooms have been converted to other purposes. The people who sat in them are mostly gone.
But the stations are still there, in different buildings, with different covers, with different technology and different tradecraft and different targets. The work continues, as it always has, in the quiet rooms behind the ordinary-looking doors, in the cities where the world is still, in various ways, being decided. On waiting, the texture of intelligence time. There is a quality of time in intelligence work that is unlike the quality of time in almost any other profession, and it is worth pausing on because it shapes everything else. It is the quality of waiting, of patience, not as a virtue practiced occasionally, but as the fundamental operating condition of the work. Consider what a CIA station officer actually does with the majority of his days. He is not, on most days, meeting an agent or planning an operation or executing a tradecraft maneuver of any particular complexity. He is, on most days, waiting for a source to develop to the point where a pitch is possible,
waiting for a recruited agent to gain access to the information that made recruiting him worthwhile, waiting for headquarters to approve an operation that has been sitting in the proposal stage for 6 months, waiting for a cable that contains the guidance needed to proceed, waiting for a contact to call back, for an invitation to materialize, for a relationship to ripen into something useful.
This waiting is not passive. It is an active, purposeful patience, filled with preparation and cultivation and the constant incremental advance of long-term operations. But it does not look like the intelligence work of popular imagination, and it does not feel like it either. It feels like a long game played in slow motion, where the moves are separated not by seconds, but by weeks and months, and sometimes years. The officers who were good at this, who could sustain the quality of attention and engagement required for the long game without becoming either complacent or impatient, were the officers who built the most lasting and productive operations. They understood something that is counterintuitive about intelligence work, that the time investment, the slow, patient cultivation, was not a prelude to the real work. It was the real work. The meeting where the agent handed over the document was the culmination of months of careful relationship building. You could not skip to the end. The waiting also created space for the particular kind of observation that distinguished excellent intelligence officers from adequate ones. A man who was in no hurry had time to notice things. The texture of a city's political mood, the changes in which officials were prominent at official functions and which had suddenly become invisible, the shifts in newspaper coverage that suggested something was happening in the government that official communiques were not yet acknowledging, the state of local markets, which could tell you things about economic conditions that no official statistic would reveal. Intelligence was not only what your agents told you, it was what you saw and heard and thought about every day in the city where you lived. The wives and families of CIA station officers in the early Cold War years deserve a particular acknowledgement that the historical record has not always given them. They lived the waiting, too, in a different register. They knew, if their husbands were under official cover, that the work was not what the cover story described. They knew at some level about the other life their husbands led, even if the specific details were not shared. They maintained the surface life, the social performances required by the cover, the dinner parties and the embassy events, and the neighborhood friendships built on foundations that were not entirely solid. They raised children in foreign cities, in languages that were not their own, in schools where the other children were also the children of diplomats and officers, and the various varieties of official stranger that foreign capitals collect. Some found this life genuinely engaging, an adventure in the deep sense, the opportunity to live inside multiple cultures and accumulate a kind of experience that ordinary life in American suburbs did not offer. Others found it isolating, disorienting, a serial uprooting that left them perpetually between places, belonging nowhere with the full belonging that ordinary settled life provides. The CIA's treatment of its officers' families in the early years was, like many aspects of the institution, improvised and uneven, better in some stations than others, better for some officers than others, rarely as thoughtful as the situation deserved. On secrecy and its discontents. The thing about secrets is that they have weight. Not metaphorical weight, or not only that. They have a physical presence in the life of the person who carries them. They take up space. They demand constant management. They shape what you can say and to whom and in what context, which means they shape every conversation you have, every relationship you maintain,
every version of yourself that you present to the world. For the CIA officers of the early Cold War stations, secrecy was not an occasional condition, but the permanent medium of their professional lives. They carried secrets about their organization, about their operations, about their agents, about themselves. The classification system that governed the movement of information within the CIA was elaborate and rigorously maintained, so that even within the agency itself, officers knew only what they needed to know for their specific assignments. Compartmentalization meant that a station officer who was running an operation in one part of his portfolio might know almost nothing about what his colleague 3 offices down was doing. This compartmentalization was security logic. It limited the damage that any single compromise could do. If an officer was caught, or turned, or simply indiscreet, the information he could provide to the opposition was bounded by what he knew, and what he knew was limited to what his own compartment contained. But compartmentalization also had costs. It created organizational friction. It made coordination difficult. It sometimes led to situations where 2 elements of the same agency were working at cross purposes without knowing it, or duplicating effort, or missing connections between pieces of information that, properly combined, would have been more valuable than either piece alone.
The secrecy also had psychological costs that accumulated over time in ways that the CIA's institutional culture was slow to acknowledge and slower still to address. People who carry significant secrets for years, who cannot fully share their professional lives with the people closest to them, who must maintain a constant vigilance about what they say and to whom, develop adaptations that are professionally useful and personally costly. The mask becomes habitual. The habit of watchful attention becomes, in some cases, a background anxiety that never entirely switches off. The professional distance required by the work infects personal relationships that were never meant to be subject to it. The men and women who staffed the early CIA stations were pioneers in this particular experience, and they were pioneers without maps. The institutional support structures for the psychological dimensions of the work were essentially non-existent in the early years. You were expected to do the job and manage the costs of doing it on your own time, in your own way, with your own resources. Some did this successfully, some did not. The ones who did not always become obvious failures. Some of them remained productive officers for years, carrying the damage quietly, not letting it show until it was too late to address. On the cities at night, a final meditation. Think of those cities at night. Vienna in the early 1950s, still rebuilding, still occupied, still haunted by the war that ended less than a decade ago, and the possibility of another one that felt, some evenings, very close. The coffeehouse lights warm in the dark streets, a tram running its late route through the old center. Somewhere in the Soviet sector, a car moving slowly. Somewhere in an apartment, a man encoding a message that will not be read until morning. Think of Berlin at night, the divided city, the lit western half and the darker eastern half beyond the sector boundary. The feel of that particular Cold War geography, the way a city could be simultaneously one place and two, familiar and alien, present and estranged. A CIA officer driving back from a meeting in the western half, checking his mirrors with the habitual attention of someone whose mirrors have occasionally needed checking. A light on in a window that should be dark. A notation in a mental ledger that is never written down. Think of Tehran in the summer of 1953, the days just before and after the coup. The heat, the political tension in the streets that anyone who was paying attention could feel. Kermit Roosevelt in his rented room, his network of contacts alive in the city around him, the operation at its most delicate juncture, the outcome genuinely uncertain. The particular quality of those waiting days, when everything has been prepared and nothing can be done except to hold the preparation steady and see what the city decides.
Think of Tokyo in the early 1950s, the city still rebuilding from the firebombing, American and Japanese and Soviet interests colliding in a landscape that was simultaneously ancient and utterly new. The CIA officer navigating between MacArthur's suspicious command and the intelligence landscape he was there to work, finding the contacts and the relationships and the understanding that would eventually make the station functional. These were real places and real people and real nights. The glamour that retrospect sometimes lends to Cold War intelligence work is not entirely false, because there was something genuinely extraordinary about it. The scope of it, the stakes of it, the sheer improbability of young Americans in foreign cities managing the levers of a global ideological competition. But the glamour is not the whole truth. The whole truth includes the fear and the fatigue and the ethical ambiguity and the long grinding patience of work that mostly looked like waiting. It includes the agents who were never celebrated because celebrating them would have been dangerous. The ordinary citizens of ordinary countries who had decided, for whatever mixture of reasons, to share what they knew with a foreign power, and who carried that decision through years of double lives, hoping that the arrangement would continue to be worth the risk, hoping that the people they were working with were as professional and as discreet as they claimed to be. It includes the families, the uprooted and the waiting, the people who held the surface life together while someone they loved was out there, in the city, or across the border, or somewhere entirely unknown, doing things that could not be discussed over dinner. It includes the bureaucrats at headquarters, the analysts and administrators and managers who processed the cables and maintained the budgets and attended the meetings and tried to make sense of a river of information that was always too much and never quite enough. All of them together, in all those cities, in all those years, built something. Not the thing they thought they were building, probably. Not the clean victory over Soviet communism that seemed like the goal. Something messier and more contingent. A world shaped by their actions and their mistakes and their occasional brilliance. A world we live in now without fully understanding how it came to be what it is. The stations were the instruments of that building. The small rooms, the midnight cables, the careful meetings in public places, the patient cultivation of human sources, the slow, patient grinding work of knowing things and trying to use what you knew. History made in whispers, in back corridors, in the careful silence of people who had learned to say less and notice more. That history is ours now. It belongs to anyone who wants to understand it. The archives are imperfect and partial, and some of them are still sealed, but enough has come out, and more will come with time, and the shape of what happened in those rooms, in those cities, in those years, is visible to anyone patient enough to look. And so we have come to the end of tonight's long, quiet journey. From the embassy gates at dusk to the cable rooms at midnight. from Berlin's divided streets to Tehran's summer heat, from the careful social performances of the diplomatic world to the deep solitude of the officers who had no diplomatic cover at all. We have walked through the history of those small, consequential rooms, listened to the fading echo of encrypted messages, sat for a moment in the particular stillness of a Cold War city at night. History is good for sleeping, not because it is boring, though it sometimes is, but because it is over. It has already happened. The anxious decisions have been made, the outcomes determined, the consequences absorbed. You can observe it without carrying it. You can inhabit it for an hour and then set it down, complete and finished, and close your eyes. The embassy is quiet now. The station chief has sent his last cable. The lights are going out one by one in the upper floors. The flag is still out there in whatever wind stirs the foreign night, and somewhere far away, across the ocean, someone is reading the cables and thinking about what comes next. But that is for them. For you tonight, it is simply over, simply done, simply history, quiet and complete, and as safe as anything can be.
If the Heyo channel has been good company tonight, please like this video and subscribe if you haven't already. We are working toward our first 1,000 subscribers, and every single one means more to this channel than I can easily say. Leave a comment with where you are and what time it reads there. And if you have any sleepy energy left to send this channel's way, please do.